For over 30 years, I've led projects and programs from the US to Australia and many countries in between. I spent 10 years cataloging and analyzing 1,200 behaviors that cause projects to fail. I spent 4 years writing this book. Each week, I will reveal one way that your project can get screwed, how you can recognize the symptoms, and what you can do to avoid the negative consequences. Let's go. All right. So every week, we'll take one randomly selected way of screwing up your project. Today, we take number 109, having weak or no evaluation criteria in your supplier selection process. We'll be looking at behaviors, consequences, and actions. So let's take a look at one of the behaviors. You have no evaluation criteria in your supplier selection process. Now, you might think this is strange, but it happens a lot of times. Many companies and many organizations know the supplier. The supplier has been providing products and services in the past. So they feel that the supplier is quite capable of delivering what is required for this current project. So they have no selection criteria at all. The next one is where you have evaluation criteria, but these are not objective. These are very qualitative and they can be subjective based on who's answering, who's asking the question, who's evaluating. They are not objective enough. All right, so the next one is where you have evaluation criteria, but none of them are knockout criteria. Now, knockout criteria is one where if a supplier does not qualify for that one criteria, they are out of the process completely. So you might have 10 criteria, out of which the supplier is good enough for 9, but not good enough for the one knockout criteria. They are out of the process. This is another one which I see very often. Organizations don't evaluate a supplier for their past performance. If they know the supplier, or if the supplier seems good enough on paper, then they don't bother to check if the supplier has delivered what is required in the past. Based on these behaviors, let's take a look at some of the consequences you might face. One of the earliest ones is that you will not be able to evaluate the supplier to the full extent. The supplier will not be able to tell you how good they are. If your evaluation criteria are very few in number, or not good enough, or not deep enough, the supplier will not be able to put their best foot forward, and you will lose out. Another consequence is that you will not be able to judge which supplier is best suited for your project. If your evaluation criteria are not good enough, you might end up choosing a supplier who's not that experienced, or who has not got the right mix of capabilities what your project requires, and you might end up with a suboptimal supplier for your project. If you're running a public or an open tender, and if you don't have good, verifiable, objective selection criteria, you might be opening yourself up for some problems, if not a lawsuit. All right, based on these behaviors and the potential consequences, let's take a look at some of the actions that you can take. The first one is that the more strategic your project, the more thought and more attention you need to pay to your supplier selection process. You want the best supplier. The best supplier who has the right capabilities as of now, with the right past experience and the right skill set for your project. Except for very minor projects, consider always to have traceable, verifiable, and objective selection criteria for your supplier process. Needless to say, the bigger the project, the more strategic it is, and the more complex it is, the more stringent your selection criteria need to be. Except for the smallest of projects, consider having at least 10% of your criteria as knockout criteria. Remember, if you have, let's say, 10 criteria, and out of them one is a knockout criteria, then whether if your supplier is good enough for the other 9, because this one criteria is so critical and so important for your project, and if a supplier does not qualify for that one criteria, then the supplier gets knocked out. Pay attention to the past performance of your suppliers for projects that are similar or related to your project. This is very important because past performance is a good predictor of future performance. And if a supplier has delivered products and services for projects in other companies which are comparable in size, within the same industry, within the same project complexity, then those suppliers should be good enough for your project as well. All right, for today's method of screwing up projects, we looked at some behaviors, some consequences, and some actions that you can take to avoid the negative consequences. Remember, this is not the full set. There are many more behaviors, consequences, and actions in the book. So make sure to read the book and get the full set for this method of screwing up your project. I hope you liked today's session. Let me know your feedback in the comments below. See you next time.